Okay, in chapter 23, we developed this new model. It's called the AS and AD model. So let's draw one of those right here. Okay, inflation, output, AS, AD. Now the focus of the new chapter 24 is how monetary policy may be conducted using this picture for intuition of the outcomes. So specifically, what is going to be the job of the Fed to control output and inflation? Let's talk about what happens when there's an adverse inflation shock. Okay, we know from the last recording that we looked at that price is coming from this direction in the big picture of the economy. It's going to be effects in AS. So specifically, if there's an adverse shock to inflation, what does that mean? There's more inflation. Okay, so a shift in. So a new AS. There's two problems with this from the perspective of the Fed having its dual mandate. It's one, there's higher inflation, and two, there's lower output. Okay, so we can see with this adverse inflation shock, output went in, inflation went up. Naturally, the Fed wants to control that in some way. So what can the Fed do? Well, we know behind AD are two equations, the money supply and money demand equation, and also the Keynesian cross. As we learned in class on Monday, we know that AD, okay, if this is a function of the Keynesian cross is a function of interest rates. Okay, we augmented the Keynesian cross to have interest rates in it. So, if the Fed can change interest rates, it can affect AD. Okay, so that's how the Fed is going to respond to an adverse inflation shock like this. So what should the Fed do here? Well, it has two possible things it could do. Okay, so if the initial amount of output was YO, now we have Y1. And if the initial amount of inflation was pi O, now we have pi 1. What can the Fed do in this situation? What can the Fed do? Okay, so if it can move AD, it has a choice of moving it to the right or to the left. So we know that moving it to the right corresponds to lowering interest rates, all else equal, and moving to the left corresponds to raising interest rates, all else equal. Okay, and we know, of course, real interest rates affected by the money supply, not directly through interest rates. What can the Fed do if it has these two choices, increase R or decrease R? Well, first, we can see that if it decreased R, it could move AD all the way to out, out, out. Okay, meaning that it could go from this new equilibrium point after the adverse inflation shock down to here, down, down. Okay, so by raising interest rates, the Fed can deflate a little bit, but it also loses some output. Okay, so by increasing interest rates, the Fed can lose some inflation, but it has a trade-off with losing some output. What about if in response to this inflation shock, the Fed decreased interest rates? It pursued some expansionary policy. In this case, and I'll use a different color so we can see where it goes, we would start at this equilibrium and go out, out, out. In that situation, we'd be hitting this point, this point, this point. So the Fed might be able to increase output a little bit, but it would be increasing inflation at the same time. So what you're starting to see is a conundrum that the Fed has to deal with every day. Expansionary monetary policy, that is decreasing interest rates, may increase output, but it will also increase inflation. On the other hand, if it increases interest rates, okay, it tries to get the economy to cool off. Then inflation might decrease, but then output will decrease as well. So the Fed has to get this just right. It has a trade-off, and it has to decide which thing it wants to pursue here. These are the kind of problems that ASAD is useful for, talking about trade-offs in monetary policy.